All right, now for our final speaker of the event. An important part of managing our urban forests is implementing a proper tree maintenance program that we can ensure the health and vitality of our trees from planting all the way through removal. Our next speaker will be exploring the importance of having a standard of tree care in our tree maintenance programs. Richard Hauer is the Director of Urban Forestry at Eocene Environmental Group and is a Professor Emeritus of Urban Forestry at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Richard has conducted research in tree biology, urban forest management, emerald ash borer management, trees and construction, tree risk management, and ice storms. He was honored as a 2018 L.C. Chadwick Award for Arboriculture Research, and in 2023, the Alex Shigo Award for Excellence. Please welcome Richard Hauer.
I'd like to wander the room if that's okay with you. Awesome. Hey, first of all, what a great lineup today from Leslie and Asia and Eric, who left us, and Brian, and also Nancy. Just a great, so round of applause for them again. They're awesome. So I get the pleasure here to be at the end and talk about tree care standards. And I've got just a wonderful array of text lines from all the standards that we're going to be reading today. I'm just kidding. How many of you find tree care standards exciting? Wow, that many? No, actually, you do it in your daily life. How many of you actually like things at work, like clickers when you hit them? Yeah, there's a standard. I think it had to be turned on, right? Yeah, that was the thing. So if you hit the turn on button, it actually works. That's a standard for these clickers. If you have a microphone and you actually have the button where you turn it on, they tend to work, correct? So anyway, standards are awesome. In the world, there's probably maybe a couple dozen different standards. Okay, when we talk about arboriculture and urban forestry. Maybe there's 100 plus, maybe a couple hundred, if you throw in best management practices that supplement the standards that we have. I heard talking about from, was it Asia, talking about scientific papers? And in the thousands and the tens of thousands and maybe in the hundreds of thousands of things that somehow touch our urban places that we live. So there's a suite of information. And I think Asia asked you how many you actually read on a daily basis. And the thing is, you're busy, right? And so really when we think about tree care standards and everything, sometimes it's hard to keep up. Is there anything in this picture that's wrong? Can anybody recognize any picture up here that's out of date? I'll give you a hint, upper left. Yeah, so we'll get to that. So actually the tree care standards, where we used to have, for example, we have the A300. Anybody know what those are all about? A300 are the tree care standards. Yeah, so basically what we do for trees, not 2 trees, 4 trees. In the Zs, we have the Z60s, which are about nursery standards, and we have the Z133, which is about safety and arboricultural practices. So these things are certainly really important. But if you look at this 10-part series, I'm glad that at least one person in this room knew that they've actually been consolidated into a suite of 10 into one. And we used to have like the 10 parts. Part 1 was pruning, awesome. Part 2 was soils, awesome. And now they're actually clauses. As people, we have to change things. I just worry about it is just call it like the pruning standard. Don't worry about calling it clause 5, because actually all the parts you add 4 to them, and that's what they are now. So pruning used to be part 1. It's now clause 5 in our consolidated standard. By the way, I've been a fortunate part of being on this A300 committee for over a decade now. Sharon Lilly, bless her heart, she asked me if I want to be part of it, and I said, sure, why not? And I tell you, I've learned so much from the cool people in the room on tree care standards. So actually being up to date. The consolidated one came out in 1923. Not even quite a year. It was about November of last year when it came out. The nice thing is you used to have to keep up with 10 of these things. Okay, and they were on a 5-year cycle of revision. It's still on a 5-year cycle, but the consolidated one, 2023, so our next target date, if there's 5 more years after 2023, it would be what? 2028. You're good with math here today in the afternoon. Yeah, so they get updated on a regular basis by people that are pretty wickedly smart. Now, When I think about standards, though, it's really about objective. And I know if I said, how many like to write objectives to get stuff done, I'm sure a lot more hands would go up, right? Like the objective is to put a tree in the ground, plant a tree. Isn't that exciting? Definitely. So really objectives. To me, when I plant a tree, and I've been fortunate to be able to plant many trees in my lifetime, including this tree here, which was a swamp white oak with my daughters. I used to actually take them by this tree on a daily or annual basis. Daily would be really pushing it. But an annual basis to take like the family photo next to the tree we planted during Arbor Day in Minneapolis. And they're like, Dad, do we have to? Yes, we have to every year. Okay, I don't remember the last time I did. It was probably 2014. But anyways, swamp white oak. In 100 years from now, I hope it to be a 100-year-old tree and turn it into a sugar maple. Okay. Well, obviously, I didn't have a chance to take like the tree DeLorean and go to the future for that tree. But regardless, my goal when I plant a tree, I want that darn thing to be around 100 years from now. Now, every time I go someplace, I travel, I call my mom. And usually it's from the Minneapolis airport, just to say hi. And as I'm walking from one concourse to the next, she goes, "Oh, you calling from Minneapolis?" I go, "No, I'm on the way to Detroit today," through a curveball. But somehow we're chatting, and she told me about, boy, if Grandma, her mom and dad were alive, Grandma would be 104, and Grandpa would be 107. Now, they passed away about 15, 20 years ago or so, but they lived to almost be centurions. So when I plant a tree or myself, I'd love to be a 100-year-old person someday. Okay? But regardless, I think in those time frames. Now, there's a lot of reasons we plant our objectives. Aesthetics, quite common. Some just beautiful pictures from throughout places that I've been able to visit. And you could think about aesthetics, whether it's like sheared European beech trees in the upper left, or in the bottom right, some gray birch trees that were formed into a lay. Just, aren't these marvelous things that give dimension to places? And really, for most people, they think about what we do. The objective is trees in the ground, but they give some purpose or cause to the places and spaces they live. Would you agree with that? And certainly as practitioners, that's really our objective. At the end of the day, urban forestry is about us or the people we work with and for. It's really about the people in the communities is really what we do. But if I ask this question without showing it yet, if I ask the general layperson, what would be, and we're playing like the tree family feud here, what would be the number one response you think people would say when they think about trees? They think about trees for shade, no doubt about it. And I used to actually be the person who was the coordinator of the shade tree program in Minnesota, and they picked shade. Why? Because in the 1970s when Dutch elm disease came, and this predates a lot of the federal programs, it predates the federal farm bill of 1990, Minnesota had a really active shade tree program, funding to the tunes of about $30 million a year back in the 1970s. It's about reforestation and managing for oak wilt and Dutch elm disease. But they called it the shade tree program for a darn good reason, because that's what people think about these trees, shade places. Getting back to my grandma, by the way, I remember going to visit her and Grandpa every summer. They had no air conditioning in the 1970s. What they had was a wickedly beautiful American elm tree on the west side of the house. And what was that doing? Shade. Good answer. Okay. And that shade tree itself, it comforted just the human comfort. They didn't need AC because they had the shade of that tree. When the tree died from Dutch elm disease, guess what they got the next year? Air conditioning. It just made a world of difference. Another grandma and grandpa story, by the way. They actually met somehow through like a blind date, and they just like fell in love to the point they eloped 2 weeks later. My grandma was a junior in high school. Grandpa, I think, had just graduated high school, and they got married 2 weeks after they met. Okay, grandma's still in high school. They don't tell the parents. Okay, so one day my great-grandma is cleaning Bernice's room and maybe putting laundry in her dresser and finds the ring. And then, Bernice, what's this all about? And then well, Bob and I got married. So then my great-grandparents and my grandpa's parents got together, and they're all happy with it, but they're like, okay, you can start living together. It's just really weird, okay? I guess that's how they did things back then. But regardless, shade trees and people. This talk gave me a chance to reminisce about those cool things. But for most people, what time period do they operate? Most people think 100 years from now. Too often we may think about the next day. But I think for urban forestry, 40 years is not a bad time frame. Reason I picked that is Greg McPherson was an influence, and Greg would always pick 40 years to do economic analyses. So I'm like, if Greg McPherson picked 40 years, must be a good time frame, right? So if I think about the urban forest, I think about a generation, really, of people. 40 years is not a bad number. Maybe it's 33.2 from an average lifespan of people. I don't know. But regardless, if I think about 40 years from now, if I think about trees in tree planting campaigns. How many have been part of like a 1 million tree campaign? Awesome, isn't that great? Did you get all 1 million trees in the ground? I don't know, but it's an aspirational goal, and it's better than 100,000, right? All right, but what's better than a 1 million tree campaign? A 5 million, like in Maryland, or maybe 50 million, or maybe you're Mr. Beast there and you only do 20 million. But what's better than like a 20 million or a 50 million campaign? A billion. We're not quite to the trillion yet. And what's better than a billion? A trillion. Okay. But yeah, there's reasons why people pick number. They're aspirational. And obviously, if you're planting 1 trillion trees, you're talking seedlings, right? And I think seedlings are so over or underrated as an opportunity. For example, New York City parks, when they got 1 million trees in the ground and they did hit that goal, it wasn't large caliber stuff. They planted a lot of seedlings in forested locations for reforestation and silvicultural work. And follow some of the work that they've been doing in New York City for urban silviculture, because a lot of our parks really are forests, they're remnant forests. And those of you that had forestry training and background, silviculture and woodland management, for example, are so underrated in the urban forestry curriculums. But let's think of something more logical, a 10 tree planting campaign. All right, and that's something we can often, or maybe just a 1 tree campaign. But regardless, we have mortality. And the reason our standards and specifications and objectives are important, because of certainly at the end of the day, if trees don't survive, we don't get the benefits, right? Anybody know kind of like the average lifespan of a tree before it pays back its debts? All, a large caliper thing. And this was work that was done in the Chicago region in the 1990s. 33 years I got. I'll take 4 contestants like the Price is Right. I got 33. 5. I heard 40. 1 more. 16. Ding, ding, ding. You get to be the first person to leave today. Okay. So 16 years, actually it was about 1 to 2 decades. And I think the science they had was 9 to 18 years depending on the site and the cost and some things. But at the end of the day, if a tree dies after 5 years, did it pay back any of the cost of society to plant that tree? The answer is no. So actually tree survival is so, so important. And so for example, how many have been involved with tree planting campaigns where survivability was very, very high? Like only 1% died. Yeah, and how did you make that happen? Work, yeah, you do maintenance, you do establishment practices, etc. And so those are not unattainable, but even with a 1% annual mortality, and when I think about tree campaigns, it's not about trees in the ground, it's trees forever. You agree with me? Yeah, so 1 million, you've said 1 million trees need to be planted in these locations. I think that's vital. So at 1% mortality, what's the multiplier? You gotta have 1.4 million trees planted in that 40-year time space to overcome the things that die. Now, what if you have some of the worst case scenarios, maybe 20% mortality? How many have actually seen plantings like that? Yeah, and look at the math there. It's a multiplier of 11. So now it's 11 million trees you need to plant for that 1 million tree campaign. Now, if it's a 1 tree campaign, you got 11 trees you're planting over that 40-year time period, okay? So regardless, tree survivability and standards and specifications are so important. Like Dr. Laura Roman, her PhD work was looking at tree survivability, and she had about 5% annual mortality from the projects that she worked with. Okay, so in that case, using her work, on average in the urban forest, we have a multiplier of about 3. Okay, and I think that's kind of a useful number. All right, so now let's look at like a 50-year post-planting. Anybody ever been to Charlotte, North Carolina? Yeah, down by the convention center, these trees are about 1 or 2 blocks away. Okay? These are willow oaks planted 50 years ago. They're about 2 feet in diameter. Does that blow you away? Now, DC has such awesome urban forestry. They had urban forestry that was awesome back in the 1800s. Then DC went through some down periods from urban forestry, and now they're back again. Okay, I've been to DC a couple times in the last few years, and man, the urban forestry, people like Casey Trees, et cetera, DOT, is just awesome. I mean, the urban forests of DC, in my opinion, are just fantastic. And certainly, if you think about this, what do you think the #1 ingredient to get these trees to look at this size? 2 feet in diameter, 50 years down the road. Soil! Excellent. You could be second to leave. All right? So, Corey, you have that going for you. Yeah, and it was soil volume. In the 1970s, by the way, a silviculturist at NC State, Dr. Thomas Perry. Anybody remember that person? Okay, I'm name dropping people that he passed away probably 30 years ago. But Dr. Perry was like the Shigo of the time, but he was the below ground person. And he was saying it's about soil volume. So he had a specification here. The spec is pretty simple. If you want a 2-foot diameter tree, he said, in 1975 or thereabout, you need to give it 40 feet by 20 feet by 2 feet deep. And what's the math on 40 times 20? 800 times 2? 1,600. And if you've ever saw James Urban, James has this graph. And James' graph says you need about 1,600 cubic feet of soil. So Dr. Perry knew this, and James Urban is a wonderful architect. James actually, Up by Roots, have you ever seen that book before? Fantastic, because it gave us some insight from an architect on things we need for design specifications. But so vital. Can you get trees to live a long period of time with little soil volume? Yeah, you can. Trick question. And this is a bonsai tree, planted in 1737. Yeah, Arnold Arboretum. It's in their rare bonsai collection. The person, I've been told, planted this tree to use in a PowerPoint presentation in the 2000 time period. No, but I'm sure this person planted this bonsai to turn on to the next generation. And lo and behold, many generations have seen this particular bonsai tree, but pretty cool. And so there's a lot of reasons. We could have an entire talk here today on why trees die, right? But it's a positive day on the 13th. I've been invited here for like 5 times now, and I was always busy, and I always felt bad. And last year when they asked me, I'm like, the date is already picked. I actually just blocked off all of September for y'all, okay? Got that? Or maybe most of it. You're welcome. But anyways, I'm not superstitious, but it is the 13th. I just like to avoid the number 13, but I love you so much that I didn't for this one, so I came here. But anyways, we could talk about the pessimistic side of urban forestry and why trees die. And now, I did my master's work with water relations of sugar maple seedlings, okay, where you subject trees till you don't give them water to see what happens physiologically. Isn't that fun, Nancy? You know, just withhold physiology and see how they don't like not having water. So if you look at the trees here, the bottom on the left side, that's a sugar maple tree. Why do you think that sugar maple tree is not doing well? There's actually a couple things. I'll give you a hint. Below ground, root system. Yeah, it's actually girdling. We'll talk about that a little bit here. But certainly there's a lot of reasons to explain why trees don't do well, and they do come back to specifications. Now, a specification or standards is about something you want to obtain, something you want, perhaps a quality of something. If I turn on the faucet to the right, what kind of water temperature do I expect? Cold, yeah. Doesn't that suck when the plumber didn't get the message which pipe to hook up to which type of water temperature? And you turn it to the right and you get scalded? So, yeah, that's where standards are important for certainly a lot of things. It's predictability. Standards are something we can measure. It's something that we expect as normal. Okay, if I get into a car and I use the ignition and I turn it to the right, what do I expect? Or unless you get one of those push buttons and you hit the push button, what do you expect to happen? Yeah, you can go someplace. So, if I think about standards also, I think about, did I miss a slide? Yeah, I think about things that, now, is there any difference between these two trees? Okay, one's taller than the other, but what has happened to these trees from the objective perhaps? And when we call it bad, it's topping. The other we call good, it's pollarding. What were they doing for these trees? They were reducing the height. That's really a height reduction. And one is good and trained that way, and the other is, it's not. It's really about the size of the branch that matters in this situation here. There's other reasons, safety. Now, a lot of reasons things happen. It's not as you think. A person just write up and say, let's write tree care standards to prevent death. In this case, unfortunately, in the 1960s, a mother lost their son. And she's like, well, let's make something good out of something bad happened. So she contacted someone, and it set this whole motion that what is now Z133, the tree care standards. So when you actually do work, and if you follow the standards, your probability of bad things happening is pretty low. Okay, now there's no guarantees that when you go out and do tree work, that you could have an accident and go to the job site. That's a common unfortunate thing is people getting accidents going to a job. Okay, or you could fall from a tree because the rope just broke and you did everything right. Things sometimes happen. But safety standards are certainly to reduce this. How long did it take before this thing actually went into practice? 4 years. And the reason, not that people are lazy, it takes time sometimes to actually get all the expert, go out for public review, bring it back, go through enumeration, so that it takes time. And that's kind of why we're on like a 5-year cycle for these standards. Some other crazy reasons. Now, I was doing root research in the 1990s, and I was curious about the tree care or the horticultural standards, or the nursery standards. And actually, they started in 1923. It wasn't about growing the best nursery stock, although nursery people are pretty awesome. In the 1920s, there were some great nurseries out there. It was about facilitating bidding. So the standards were developed, so when I say I want a 2-inch tree that's of a certain type broadleaf, there's dimensions from height and canopy spread. So it's for about predictability. And again, these things actually have been around for over 100 years. The most recent standard for the Z160 came out in 2014 revision. I think they're in the process of re-looking at that. They're on about a 10 to 15 year cycle for the nursery standard. Now, we already talked about the part 6s, for example, like tree planting became clause 10, and we could just call it the transplanting and planting standard, okay? So we'll talk a little bit about specifications and things for planting trees. And now I got into, I don't know, tree planting research and what happens if inappropriate things happen with some trees that were dying in the Minneapolis, St. Paul metropolitan region in the 1990s with my good mentor and friend Gary Johnson. And so literally, city foresters called us out and said, we have trees that are dying. And these are Norway maple trees, by the way. What is one disease that starts with a V that you could think of is causing the decline of a Norway maple tree? Verticillium wilt, yeah. And so we actually looked at it, a classic field diagnosis. If you take a branch, you look for some olive green staining perhaps, and if so, you can take it to a laboratory and they can confirm it's verticillium. We had clear wood. We could find no evidence of verticillium. And so we still sent samples to the pathology lab. The University of Minnesota came back as negative. We knew they were going to be. That was like $300 wasted. But sometimes you got to rule out the thing that you think it's not happening. But we had a shovel. We saw trees like this. Yeah, and it actually came about, Gary and I came up with the term stem girdling roots. And it wasn't because we were like, hey, let's make the world crazy. Gary had we had a publication we had to put out. We had to put a title on it. And Gary wanted girdling root syndrome. And I saw the movie China Syndrome. Any of you saw that one? I didn't like it, so I'm like, I want no syndrome in any title of any publication ever in my life, I think. I'm like, first time Gary ever saw me, like, no! And Gary's like, man, you're kind of an angry person. I'm like, no, I just don't want syndrome. He's like, okay. And then I said something, Gary's like, no, if I don't get syndrome, you can't have that. And so we started talking. It's like, what's the problem? And we're like, well, a root wrapping around the stem. And we're like, let's just call it stem girdling roots of trees. And we're like, well, it makes sense, like a root weevil, a stem borer, leaf blight. So you're giving a proximity to where the pathological problem is. And it actually, fortunately, it stuck. And we were kind of like, people are either going to love it or hate it. When you ever go out on a limb here, no pun intended, with tree stuff, sometimes people love it and sometimes they don't. Now, watering trees weekly. If I had to say two things, planting trees at the proper depth and watering, you can forget about a lot of other things. Yeah, right tree at the right place, blah, blah, blah. But as Elmer Elm says here, okay, it costs about $3 to $5 per month to water trees. Now, this is city of Minneapolis, a dry time period. They're asking residents, would you plant or would you water trees? And they're like, it's going to cost, that's a big tree. And they actually did some math, and it was not a lot of money. And the city of Minneapolis said, we'll actually give you $5 off of your watering bill. People are like, it's $5, it's like a cup of coffee, no big deal. Okay, and I love Leslie had her mascot picture earlier this morning. For whatever reason, I took a picture, and I just couldn't resist putting it in today. So anyways, Elmer Elm. Another Elmer Elm story, he came out in the 1970s as the mascot for Urban Forestry Minneapolis. And there's been many iterations. The early Elmers were really scary looking. Okay, the new ones look pretty friendly. But regardless, it's about promoting urban forestry and having fun. Elmer Elm also got stole one day, where some kids in Bloomington, Minnesota did a little hijinks. They saw Elmer Elm, a Minneapolis person, for whatever reason, was in Bloomington that day, and went into the local 7-Eleven, which there is Tom Thumbs, and took the mascot off, put it outside, and these kids from West Bloomington Jefferson High School are like, great opportunity, they stole Elmer. And then it's like 2 days later, they felt guilty and turned Elmer back in, no questions asked. But anyways, watering. And these are some specifications prescriptions. This is actually from Ed Gilman. And I love this. It's about the size of a tree and how often. How many of you actually water trees every day? I used to work at a nursery. Casey Trees people, you got a nursery. How often do you water containerized plants? Or maybe you have just trees in the ground. Okay, but I used to work at a nursery. Containerized plants were watered every day. Sometimes twice a day if your boss didn't like you. No, if it was a hot day, so you watered them often. And so does it make any sense when we transplant trees to say, oh, we can water them once a week? So what Ed did, and there's a scientific paper, Ed found if you don't water trees, they die at a higher rate than if you do. Okay? Pretty cool. Now, I'd tell my dad stories of research I was doing. Like, I can't remember the first time I told him about something. And he's like, well, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, trees in construction. I told him that if you do construction by trees, that they die at a higher rate than if you don't. He scratches his head. He was a farmer. He's like, son, I could have told you that if you damage trees, they're probably going to be more likely to die. But we got a percentage of like extra mortality, and we could use that to actually promote ways to minimize damage to trees. But anyways, just a cool watering specification. University of Florida still has this up on Ed's website. But I could go on and on and on about tree planting specifications. But at the end of the day, okay, specifying what you want. Should we remove wire baskets from transplant trees or not? Awesome, do it. Anybody say not to? Awesome, then don't do it. But if I'm a person, I'm hiring you to plant trees and I want wire baskets to be removed, what should I do? Write that in there. I'll tell you why to me it doesn't matter, because I did a study with Dr. Andrew Kozer where actually we looked at the effects of removal wire baskets, partial removal or no removal. We found no difference. After 1 year, after 2 years, we've got data up to 9 years, no difference. Okay? I call it the everyone wins study. But I was trained by Bob Miller to remove the wire baskets from trees. And if Bob taught me to do that, I was also trained by John Ball, remove the wire baskets from trees. So if John taught me that, darn it, that's what I'm going to do. If I was trained by someone to say leave it on, I'd probably stick my ways if my mentor told me to do that, right? I was also told by a really good mentor, Brad Peterson, I guess he got this one wrong because that's what the textbook said, plant trees deep and proud if it's a dry season. Anyone ever hear of that one? You could find in textbooks in some places in the 1970s and 80s that said that. And unfortunately, it makes sense maybe for corn seeds, okay, but it doesn't for woody plants, okay. So I guess I'm paying for my sins planting trees deep when I was a kid. So anyways, let's talk a little bit about pruning specifications and standards. And now, prior to 1991 is when Part 1 came out, when they formed the A300 committee. Not that long ago. Okay, I was an undergraduate in an urban forestry program at that time. But can you believe people don't get along? Or they have different ways to do things, or different opinions and ideas? So really, before 1991, there was a lot of different standards. The National Arborist Association, named at that time, it's now TCIA, they had a standard which most people actually used. I'll talk a little bit about that. But the various federal agencies, state agencies, other folks had different standards that at the end of the day is about predictability and things that were good for a tree. All right. So anybody remember the Class 1 or Class 2 or Class 3 or Class 4 pruning? Anyone? Or am I just that old? I'm 57, okay? I don't feel old. But I was trained actually to have to learn and memorize Class 1 pruning. What is that? Is that fine or is that coarse pruning? I don't remember. Okay, but regardless, we used names. And does this picture kind of give a concept? Class 1, you take more stuff away than Class 3. Where you're just taking dead and branches that could fall and hit you. Okay, so it's really an objective that people are trying to attain, but that's just what they called it. All right? And now let's look at Class 1 pruning. This is like getting a car wash where you get everything done in 2 coats of wax, biff. Okay? And so you're like removing of dead, dying, diseased, decayed, interfering, objectionable, obstructing, weak branches, as well as selective thinning to lessen wind resistance. Now, is there anything up here, any of these words that you could argue, perhaps there's some science now to say it's just the opposite? What about selective thinning to lessen wind resistance? Yeah, do trees dance? And if you need to get up right now just to get some exercise, want to do a tree dance? You know, trees are awesome. Watch them sway. I was watching one sway. Actually, right now you can watch these sway if you get bored. Like just doing the little thing, tree dance, but they're really trying to dampen the load. Okay? So trees are marvelous. They have ways to do that. Now, there's sometimes we do reduce the size of branches to maybe because of structural things to reduce the impact of wind, but our understanding is way different today than when they came up with the standard. What about removal of dead stuff? Is there science to say leaving dead parts in trees is maybe not a bad thing? It was about a decade ago. I was in a talk listening to a person speak in Australia. I was blown away. They were talking about dead, decayed parts in trees that were like 150 years in the making, and there was this one insect that just showed up. I'm like, wow, ecologically, that's pretty insane. Now, no one ever taught me that in college, to go leave some dead stuff because there's organisms that may want it. Now, I'm a Shigo disciple, and Shigo back then, Shigo's awesome. Not disrespecting him, but he's like, take away dead things because they're sugar cubes to cause more decay in a plant. Our science now says, yeah, there's more to the picture here. All right, so pruning trees, is it really needed? Boy, my wife and I had been married for 4 years, and it's a Saturday morning. I wake up, I have an idea what I want to do, and she wakes up, hey, let's walk the dogs. I'm like, no, maybe later, but I want to prune the trees. And she goes, trees don't need pruning. I go, yeah, they do. And she goes, well, do trees in the forest need pruning? And I said, well, I'm going to do it anyways. And like 2 days later, we spoke later. I just sent her a text early. I said, a quick question before I talk today. Do trees need to be pruned? She writes back, they do not. And if you prune our trees again, I'm filing for divorce. No, she actually, she shunned me, ghosted me. She hasn't got back to me yet, but maybe by the end of today's talk. I'm not kidding you. I pruned the trees. I like slammed the door, and I didn't think we'd get to number 5, okay? We've been actually married ever since. We got over it somehow, but yeah. But trees need to be pruning for a lot of reasons. Now, there used to be things we'd use terms like crown cleaning, thinning, raising. These are methods. We no longer use these. If you want to talk about crown raising or thinning or cleaning, that's okay. 9 out of 10 arborists do recommend ivory soap for crown cleaning, though, just saying. It's a joke, lighten up, okay? Crown cleaning soap, get it? I'm a dad, I got dad bad jokes. All right, but the industry standards really are voluntary. And if we think about it, do you have to use standards and specifications? No. I'd also say, what's the worst that could happen if something happens and a judge says, so lawyer, are there any standards out there? Are there? Yeah, because I told you in a professional talk today that there's standards, so now you're all obligated to actually know about them. Okay, just saying. But they are voluntary, but really at the end of the day, they're used to really give a consensus for the industry or the field of practice that we're in. Okay. So there's shalls and shoulds. A shall is its requirement. It's kind of like thou shalt not steal. Okay? There's no wiggle room. It'd be kind of nice if it was like should. Thou should not steal. You know, I really wanted that candy bar really bad. But no, shalls are mandatory. There's not a lot of shalls in our specifications. The reason being, trees are dynamic, they're biological, there's a lot of things that we can't, but we can talk about shoulds. And these are really based on our circumstances, our knowledge, our judgments, our science at any point of time, okay? So at the end of the day, shalls and shoulds, and there's also another word that we've been recently using because we're allowed to do it by the authorities that actually accredit us that have like the A300 Standards Committee. Okay, may. May is permissive, like you may use a shovel to do a soil survey, okay? Because what could happen if you used a shovel and you cut a root and it got verticillium wilt? Okay, your action of getting a soil survey caused that tree to die. But if we have in the standard, thou shalt use a shovel, you're using a practice that's accepted, okay? And that's kind of crazy. Sometimes they have to do things like that. But again, the pruning standard. Jeff Kempter, don't know if you know Jeff, hope some of you do. Jeff is I would say a mentor of mine because I've learned so much from Jeff. But he's retired now, but he worked for the Aspen Tree Expert Company. He's a utility forester, but he also worked in the commercial and municipal side part of his life. But Jeff was the chair of the committee when we came up with this new set of terminology, going away from things that were like crown cleaning and thinning, which were methods, switching over to what we called objective systems and cuts. Again, getting away from these methods. And again, nothing wrong with using words, but our specifications and standards now talk about objectives, systems, and cuts. I'll talk about these. All right, an objective is nothing more than something you're trying to accomplish. Okay, so objective could be, can you give me some objectives of pruning? Okay, so clearance, so maybe elevation above the ground, clearance from vehicles like a UPS truck. Some other objectives. A branch that is just like going to fall on a person. Yeah, hazard or risk abatement. Yeah, because you just wanted it like 6 feet. Are you like a Swabian German? Yeah, because the Swabians, I'm German, so I guess I can make fun of the Swabians, but really anal, it's like, got to have it at 6 feet because it just looks nice that way. But regardless, objectives are something we do. And a system is how you're going to maintain it over time. So a lot of different objectives. Some of these that you gave to me could be vista pruning. It could be sunlight infiltration to power your PV solar collector system. But an objective is something you're trying to accomplish with your pruning. And I thought that was pretty brilliant. I was on the committee. It took us about 3 years to actually get to the point where like, yeah, we finally get it, Jeff. We get what you're talking about. Things like the next part, pruning systems. And Jeff said, we either do things that are natural or artificial. We're like, what are you talking about? We're like, there's nothing natural about us pruning trees, according to my wife also, right? And so natural pruning, no. Jeff would say it's what we're doing to a tree to maintain the objective we're trying to accomplish. And then there's some other unnatural things like planting. So by the way, this is natural pruning, doing a reduction because this tree, in this case eucalyptus tree, had died back after 13 years of extreme drought in Canberra, Australia. Okay, so we could reduce the deadwood out of this tree for just safety perspectives because there's a road next to these trees along with sidewalks. But a lot of different things. Okay, these are all objectives in a system that we're using natural. We're still using the natural biology of a tree. The tree's going to certainly regrow after we prune a branch, right? It's going to next year grow a little bit more, next year grow some more. And then maybe if it's clearance, so elevation above the ground, we're going to come back maybe 4 years from now to do some more elevation pruning so the UPS truck doesn't prune the tree for us. But then pruning systems, planting. I finally got it maybe a decade ago. I knew about planting as a student, that it's height reduction, but it's really about a system that you're maintaining. I was in Sweden where I saw these trees planted, and I get it. They're height reduction, why? So you could see these wickedly cool old buildings. Okay, at least that's how I took out of what planting made sense to me there. All right. Topiary. If you want to have a plant look like a dolphin, you can do it according to the standard. It's a system now. If you want a spalier where you're training like apple trees against a wire system, maybe against a wall, that's a system. Would you say this is natural or artificial? Because once you do this, or if you do a dolphin, if you stop pruning into a dolphin, what does it become? Just a blob of green stuff. Okay, or pleaching, where you actually have rows of trees, where you're actually intertwining branches together. So these are all systems that we're trying to obtain some sort of objective to go along with it. Now there's thou shalt not top a tree, okay? Now I'll get back to actually heading cuts, which this is, by the way. Thou shalt not lion's tail. I was actually taught to lion's tail. Why? Because you wanted air to go through the tree. How many were taught to lion's tail? Yeah, because why? It just made sense until we did science to say it wasn't right. Okay, flush cut pruning. Yeah, I remember my father-in-law flush cut his apple trees. He goes, hey, Rich, check it out. What do you think of my pruning? Now, I wanted to marry his daughter, so I didn't want him to like say, no, you can't marry my daughter. So I said, geez, Phil, I bet you have great apple production next year. And there's something about wounding apple trees, you get increased production. Now, I don't know if it was a flush cut pruning, but man, he had a wicked good apple crop the next year. So and I just kind of looked the other way on his flush cut pruning of his apple trees. Now, let's talk about specifications and really why and how we use these standards. Having something like the physical location of a tree. Hopefully none of you in this room have ever had the bad day where your crew cuts down the wrong tree because they're at the wrong location. I've been an expert witness where I've came in to say that tree is worth so much money because unfortunately someone removed the wrong tree. It's so easy these days to take a picture of the tree in front of the greenhouse at 123 Oak Street. Oh, it wasn't 213 Oak Street? No, it was 123. Well, it says on the invoice 213. Oops, someone had a typo. It's a bad day. But regardless, having the physical location, having things like what the objective or system is, the part to remove, how much dosage. If you know Lindsay Purcell, Lindsay, this is his table here, and we really don't have much science to say 50% is the magical threshold for a young tree. But we know old trees, less stuff or no stuff out of a tree unless you have a good reason to take it out, because older trees have less dynamic mass than younger trees. And things like location in the crown. Is it in the lower part for elevation? Is it on the side for utility line clearance? Is it over in this location, these three branches, so I can see the vista, I can see the mountain? The cut type, which we'll get into. We just remove branches or we reduce branches. If you want to use thinning or cleaning or et cetera, that's fine. But really, thinking about the cut type is really, really important. In the size range. And what are you going to do with the debris in the time frame to complete? If you're a commercial arborist, any commercial arborists here? Or if you have friends, how far backed up are they right now? 4 weeks? 2 weeks? If I asked this question 3 years ago, they'd say, oh man, we're 8 to 12 weeks out because there's a lot of COVID stimulus money, okay? And people just like, we're bored, we're at home, let's get our trees pruned. But regardless, again, getting at these cuts, removal cuts, all you're doing is removing a branch to the parent stem. Now, it's suspecting several of you if I said, what would you call if you take a branch and you cut it to the stem, you'd say you would remove it. But that's just the terminology. Again, it took us 3 years to actually get to the point of using a terminology like we're removing a branch or we're reducing the branch. And that's where you're taking the parent stem, removing it to a lateral branch. So we either reduce the length of a branch or we remove the entire branch to the parent stem. Okay? Pretty simple terminology. Heading cut. Is this bad arboriculture or done for a reason? First of all, what are the sizes of these branches here? Maybe my fist, maybe 1.5 fists, okay? And this is not topping. In this case, this is actually done for a reason. If you're doing plarding, you actually have to start with a heading cut. And then you actually then, when twigs grow back, you cut them back to that spot where they come off. Now, I was in England 2 years ago, and I heard someone talking about the knucklehead pruning, and I thought like a knucklehead, a bad arborist. No, that's called the knucklehead from plarding, if you didn't know that. Okay, where all those twigs regrow off of that area. So a heading cut is done for plarding, but also restoration pruning. One option in Florida, hurricanes, or even here where you have windstorms, you can remove the tree if broken branches have, or you do a heading cut, and then it becomes later on, you're managing for sprouts that grow off of that. So does that open your eyes a little bit if you didn't think about that? Sometimes a heading cut, where you think that you're topping a tree, it has an objective to actually restore the tree, to retain the canopy that you heard earlier is an important part in Fairfax County, retaining trees. And we had a study in Florida, we found that heritage tree ordinances, communities that had those had 6% greater canopy than those that did not have heritage tree. Tree preservation ordinances, there's no difference in communities that had them or did not. It's actually retaining, where you say you have to retain an old heritage tree. All right, so we remove, reduction, heading, shearing cuts. So this is a shearing cut. It's really a heading cut, but you have a specific purpose here, have European beeches into a hedge tree. Now, removal, reduction, heading, and heading. All right, internodal or nodal. So inadequate specifications, things like prune trees to A300s. Now, I've seen in my academic life, I've seen a lot of RFPs. I've seen in my professional life now a lot of RFPs. I've seen ones that prune trees according to A300 standards. Is this inadequate? Yeah, it is, because there's a lot of stuff actually being prescriptive, and we'll get to that. Prune crown to reduce hazard. What hazard are we talking about? I'm not quite sure. Raised crown for vehicle and pedestrian traffic. How far above the ground? Yeah. Prune to improve structure. Now, your idea of structure may be different than mine. I've got an arborist friend, and I paid him $200 for a load of wood chips, and he said they were really good chips. I wanted to top dress a bed. And I get him on last Friday, I'm like, it's twiggy, leafy material. It's like, and so anyways, I sent him a message going, I wasn't really happy. He's like, wow, this is what good wood chips are. I'm like, okay, whatever. I'm the one that was stupid. I didn't say give me a sample to look at it. But I wasn't prescriptive to say I want no leafy material in my stuff I'm paying $200 for. Okay, am I salty about that? No, I'm okay. But pruning trees to achieve clearance from conductors. Again, there's no specificity here. And so a case here, municipal specification. If you just talk about pruning, what are you removing? How far above the ground? How much living foliage? What are we really doing to improve structure? So being specific, it's not that hard. So for example, if a better specification, I'd say maybe I want only branches greater than 2 inches. I'm lucky. My thumb, I got bored one day during COVID, I measured it with a caliper, it's 1.00 inches. So pruning trees that are greater than 2 Hauer thumbs for me. I would speculate most of your thumbs are about 1 inch in diameter. So that'll give you some perspective for measuring. But again, we're being specific on size and what we're actually removing. We're being specific on raising crowns above a street, 15 feet, 14 feet, 16 feet, 17 feet. You're really having a reason for the distance above the ground, whether it's sidewalk, because we don't have a lot of 10, 15 foot tall people in the world, okay, but maybe having it above 8 feet because there are 7 feet tall people. All right, and how much living mass, or maybe a smaller tree are the only ones we're going to structurally prune, because it becomes a challenge to really structurally prune a tree when it's 2 feet in diameter versus when it's 6 inches in diameter. And if you're a customer calls you, you're a commercial arborist, and I look at this picture and they say, well, I'm concerned about aesthetics. I don't like leaves falling on the building, and I want safety for people that come to visit me. And so I could write a specification going, well, I'm going to remove branches. And they said something about they really like the aesthetics, so maybe smaller diameter deadwood, okay? And maybe 1 inches. And maybe a minimum of 6 feet away from the roof to minimize the number of leaves falling onto it. Now, could I leaf-proof that roof? Yeah, I could. Take it and not have it flat anymore. Actually have a roof that has a pitch to it, maybe a 412. Okay, but yeah, it's a flat roof, so trying to minimize leaves, you could probably prune it away from it. And things such as raise the crown 10 feet above the walkway, prune crown 3 feet from the side of the building, remove no more than 25% because it's about a 2-foot diameter tree. And pruning specifications shall use the 2017 Part 1 or the latest revision. And obviously the latest revision always came out in what year? 2023, awesome. Now, pruning trees, is it really needed? Let me see if my wife has texted me back yet. Makes it, she gave me 2 emojis. One, tongue sticking out, and another one, I don't know what that means. Does that mean she's happy or kind of like consulting with a lawyer right now as you speak? I don't know, but regardless, pruning trees, is it needed? Things like pruning. How many of you are taught to remove 1/3 of the branches at planting? Yeah, and interesting enough, there's science to say it has no impact because trees produce photosynthesis through their leaves, if you didn't know that. That'll be on the arborist exam. But they also have buds and auxin. When you remove twigs, what are you removing? Buds that produce auxins. And what do auxins do? They stimulate root growth. Interesting enough, it was not until the mid-1980s when Carl Whitcomb was doing a study, and they fortuitously found out that if you prune trees in a nursery study, they did not do as well for growth as those that were unpruned. And I love this study that came from England by Walmsley. He found that if you don't water trees, roots don't grow as much if you water trees. But if you water trees and you don't prune them, you have greater root growth than those that were pruned. Okay, so there's a lot of science to say pruning trees at planting. Now, I'm not talking about maybe a broken branch, but the indiscriminate 1/3 pruning at planting to overcome watering, not important. Now, structural pruning, an aspect ratio. Robert was interested on this. Basically, an aspect ratio of the parent stem. Let's say it's a 10-inch tree, and you got a 6-inch branch. 6 divided by 10 is 0.6. Yeah, 0.6 or higher. Those are branches you may want to prune. If it's lower than that, like a 4-inch branch coming off a 10-inch stem, really structurally they're probably sound. There's some science to say you won't have to really worry about structural pruning for science. Things like this, though, included bark, good or bad? Well, interesting enough, I have a study in Florida that Andrew Kozer collected the data. We crunched the numbers, we found none of the trees that had included bark that were in the data set actually failed during the storm. Okay, and I won't get into the details. I'll say bark inclusion is not necessarily a good thing. The trees that we studied on there were live oak trees in Florida. Much different tree than these Norway maple trees in Minnesota where they're from. Because my experience with included bark in some situations is they grow and they grow, bad things happen. They crack and then they split during an ice storm. Yeah, so structural pruning can be important. Again, getting back to aspect ratio. But just having bark inclusion isn't necessarily a bad or good thing. Okay, it's how much of the inclusion do you actually have in the branch and how big it is and how much wind do you later get. And certainly my friend Gary Johnson, they have work data from Minnesota area, Minneapolis to be specific, and they found during storms 84% of things that failed could be predicted. The data set we had were like trees that were deeply planted, they failed from SGRs, stem growing roots, or branches that were large and they failed because bark inclusion, or branches that were dead and they failed because why? They had wind. Okay, so there's a lot of explanation behind this. And if you think about like the economics of like a specification for pruning, in this case some work from Australia where they actually found there was about a 15-to-1 return on investment. So small tree pruning, and sometimes it's challenging to get maintenance budgets. And the reason being we maintain small trees. Why? Because at the end of the day, maintaining a small tree is super vital important because it's return on investment later on in life that you're not picking up the brush. Well, I thank you for your time. Again, it takes 100 years to get a 100-year-old tree. And that's my objective. When I use specifications, it's really about thinking 100 years from now and turning that swamp white oak into a sugar maple. For most of us, thinking about a 4-year time frame makes a lot of sense. And I hope if there's anything you took out of this talk today, it was more than just one thing, is really thinking about the metrics here. If you want this slide, send me an email, okay, r.hauer@uwsp.edu, and I'll send you the slide. But I was putting this together last year for the World Urban Forestry Forum, and it's really about standard specifications, and it made me think about survivability. I crunched some numbers in a hotel room, and it's like, I think these metrics are quite important here. So I thank you again for your time, and hopefully my wife, those emojis are happy notes and not sad notes. And I thank you because this is actually 30 years ago. We got married, and this was our anniversary picture last year, and we got 31 coming up this year, hopefully. All right, so I thank you very much, and some time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Richard. We got a few minutes for questions, so we'll have some people going with the mic. So if you have a question, please raise your hand.
I have two strange questions. One is, what do you do when have you run up against competing pruning objectives, and specifically HUD requirements, and a lot of elementary schools require a lot of clearance pruning, and so, just when you get a HUD grant, half of the tree gets chopped off. And then the second question is, a friend of mine, it's a completely separate question about deep planting, called me up from Colorado where she got a job to ask me, have I ever heard about burying trees in those dry zones? Have you heard about that?
First question was, what about competing specifications? For example, there's HUD. There's specifications that require certain things to be done. Insurance companies, for example, also say you have to remove a tree before you reissue your policy or do pruning away from the house. It may not be the best practice. Unfortunately, some of these specifications are being developed with good intention. Insurance, person that writes insurance claims, they're trying to minimize the expenses to ratepayers and protect profits, blah, blah, blah. So they're good intention, but maybe not good biology behind that decision. And so sometimes, like the HUD, they're probably doing clearance because, my goodness, if you have branches, you can't see kids and bad things could happen. So there might be good intentions there, but the flip side, bad outcome of less canopy in health perspectives. Yes, I have heard about planting trees deep. That's how I was trained in the 1980s. It was actually about depth. Plant them deeper during dry time periods, okay? I cannot tell you about all trees in the world. I can tell you things like green ash trees. You plant them deep, they'll regenerate a root system near the surface, and they just march onward. If you plant a sugar maple deep, they're not a riparian species like green ash. They're an upland species. They will unlikely not regenerate root systems off their stem. Bad things happen. So it does matter on the species, but in general, that's a tricky one. I'd say finding species that are suitable for those locations or get them established is probably an important thing for putting canopy in dryland areas. Great question.
All right, we have a question over here.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation. Jack with Montgomery County Department of Transportation. I run into a lot of containerized stuff with lots of stem girdling roots, and always struggle to explain to the contractor like what standard is being violated if it's not a certain diameter. I know like Gilman is big on shaving the root ball when you go between, or the container when you go between, or sizing up to a higher container size. Is something like that in the new standards, or is it being considered?
In the ISA, or I should say the ANSI A300, that's actually not addressed the boxing or shaving, depending on University of Minnesota term or the Florida term. It's the same thing. If you're not familiar with that, you've got a root system that is encircling inside the container. Literally what you're doing is those roots that are going away from the stem, you're cutting those off. So now the root that you cut goes straight away. Survivability works awesome. Shaving or boxing, whatever you use, is an important way to correct that defect at planting. But then you have to follow up with water. Whether you box or shave or not, and if you don't water afterwards, bad things happen. But if you water, they had high levels of survivability, no different than the trees that were not boxed or shaved. Okay, but that's just a specification where you actually have it specified in there. And then you have maybe a picture diagramming what boxing or shaving is all about. okay? And the depth part in a container, interesting enough, trees often get planted deep in a container with the idea that it's greater stability, or you need to put that graft union slightly below ground to protect it, okay? I was part of a study, we never published it. I've got the data analyzed. We found trees that were deeply planted in the container actually were more whippy than trees that were actually at the surface like they should be. Interesting enough. Then after about a month, there's no difference. But interesting enough, it was contrary to the reason why you'd bury it deep in a container. It's like a fence post. Put it deep in the ground, you're better off, right? We found just the opposite. Okay. That answer your question, Jack? Was it Jack? Awesome, thanks.
All right, we have time for one more question.
All right, we have a question right here.
Thanks so much, Rich. You kind of touched on this halfway through, but I felt like it was a little unresolved about whether you, for health, tree health, not risk, you need to prune out dead wood from the canopy. You said that was a Shigoism, but you're not, you know.
Yeah, the thing was referring back to what I learned from Shigo was you remove dead wood. Why? Because dead wood is a carbon source for decay organisms. And I can't say yes or no. There's some data that's coming from Europe to say, probably not. Okay, the trees already compartmentalized that off, so that's really not something to worry about. And it's really about management of decayed stuff and dead stuff in areas where it's not above any person to hit them on the head. So safety and risk management is important. But in places where it's like maybe we don't need to remove because the risk of actually that dead branch falling and hitting someone isn't that big a deal. Or maybe actually smaller diameter stuff we leave. And so just the science saying, dead stuff, there's a lot of organisms in the world, a lot of important ecological connections that are occurring that we didn't consider before from pruning practices. So great question, Corey.
Thank you so much, Richard, for your talk today.